Good afternoon. Today I will be talking about the sexual arousal patterns of bisexual men. This was a study that was completed by Reiger and his colleagues in 2005, and then later revisited by Rosenthal and his colleagues in 2011. First, the New York Times article published in 2005 covered the Reiger study. It was entitled Straight, Gay, or Lying, implying that you were straight, or you were gay, or you were just lying if you said you were bisexual. So I'm going to read you this quote. I hope you can all see it. But the study is the largest of several small reports suggesting that the estimated 1.7% of men who identify themselves as bisexual show physical attraction patterns that differ substantially from their professed desires. So the article captured the idea that the study concludes that what's happening in the brains of bisexuals does not match what's happening in their physiological genital response. Further, there was a survey performed in 1997 that concluded that 40% of all homosexual men would previously identified themselves as bisexual. This idea led to the theory that bisexuality is merely a transition from wherever to a later sexual identity, with bisexuality as a period of exploration. So you all saw this Kinsey attraction scale, or read about it in the book, but this is what it actually looks like. It's a scale from 0 to 6, based off of 0 being completely heterosexual, or 6 being exclusively homosexual, and 1 to 5 was considered varying degrees of bisexuality, with 3 in the middle being half and half, supposedly. So what Reiger and his colleagues did, and I'll explain their hypothesis in just a few slides because you need the methodology to be able to understand it. They had 101 participants, 30 homosexual men, 33 bisexual men, and 38 heterosexual men. They had a mean age of 31, and they were all from the Chicago area. What they did is they brought these men into the lab, into a private viewing room, much like Rebecca's study, where they watched a nice landscape scenery for 11 minutes on a film, followed by raunchy lesbian sex, meant to be a heterosexual stimuli. They then repeated the cycle, showing the landscape again for 11 minutes, followed by raunchy homosexual sex, meant to be a homosexual stimuli. They measured sexual arousal in 2 different ways. The first with a penile, mercury and rubber penile gauge, measuring the girth of the penis. And the second, they were asked to self-report their own feelings of sexual arousal. Now, I'm going to spend a while on this slide because this graph is confusing, and I've actually modified it so it's not as confusing as it would be. But basically, we can look at this graph as sexual orientation on the bottom, completely heterosexual on the 0, completely homosexual on the 6, and varying degrees of bisexuality in between. On the y-axis, they put hypothetical sexual arousal. So this is for either self-reported or the penile gauge. And what they thought was that in response to the homosexual or heterosexual stimuli, we can view this as the summation of a sexual arousal. So homosexuals and heterosexuals would have the same level of total overall sexual arousal, whereas bisexuals would be would have a greater summation of sexual arousal total to heterosexual and homosexual stimuli, and would therefore have the highest summation of sexual arousal at the bisexual medium, increasing and then decreasing. Does that make sense? Okay. So we're going to look at the results here. First, this is the hypothetical sexual arousal with a negative quadratic relationship. And what they actually found was for actual genital arousal, they saw a straight line, indicating that bisexuals, 1 to 5, had the same level of summation of sexual arousal as the heterosexuals and the homosexuals, which was not what they predicted. So they asked what they can conclude from this. They concluded that basically bisexuals showed a sexual arousal pattern as either heterosexual or homosexual in their straight-line genital response. So they only experienced sexual arousal to one stimuli or the other, or in complete summation, the same level as heterosexual or homosexuals. But their actual subjective arousal, the cognitive sexual arousal that they reported, showed this negative quadratic relationship, which showed that bisexuals actually thought they were experiencing more sexual attraction than they actually were physiologically. So the limitations of the Riger study in 2005 were that it was based off of only 2 markers for everyone when they recruited their participants. The first being the Kinsey scale, and the second being self-reported sexual identity. These 2 elements had a correlation of 0.95, indicating that bisexuals who reported themselves as bisexual scored the same on the Kinsey scale, meaning bisexual self-reported were bisexual on this Kinsey scale. But they didn't take into account, when recruiting these participants, any bisexual history or any longevity of bisexual experiences. So what Rosenthal and his colleagues in 2011 sought out to do was to correct that and recruit bisexuals who only had a certified history of bisexual sexual activity. So they had the same methodology. They used 100 men with a mean age of 34. But what they did this time is they set up stringent criteria for a bisexual to be in the study. They had to have 2 partners of each sex, and at least 2 partners of each sex, and also have at least one 3-month relationship with each sex. And the results are clear. So we see again general arousal on the left and subjective arousal on the right. And we see this negative quadratic relationship for both, indicating that men with a significant history of bisexual sexual activity actually had a genital arousal that matched their subjective arousal, indicating that the summation of bisexual sexual arousal was indeed higher than both heterosexual and homosexual to both stimuli. The limitations of both of these studies was that the stimuli themselves were actually not bisexual stimuli. They were 2 women meant for a heterosexual stimuli, and 2 men meant for a homosexual stimuli. In fact, a later study did kind of the same thing, but used a stimuli with 2 men and 1 woman. Why that's a exclusively bisexual stimuli, I don't know. But again, this is an extremely small sample size in one geographical region, so it's hard to expand it to the rest of the world. Further research could include bisexual women. As you all read, that bisexual women, it's very hard to measure their physiological responses because women are much more sensitive than men, let's say. But another question what researchers might ask is, why might it be advantageous for men to adopt a bisexual identity? Perhaps this sign could give you some indication. But in conclusion, these 2 studies and the conflicting data that they show the importance of methodology. They made one tiny change in the criteria of the participants and got completely different results, negative to positive results. Second, the conclusions of the Rosenthal study indicate that bisexuality transitionary theory is really not entirely true. Yes, there are many bisexuals who identify as bisexuals who may be en route somewhere else, but those with a real history of being bisexual show biological, physiological, and cognitive responses to bisexual stimuli. Thank you.